First, like all of us, I'd like to join with our fellow citizens and my colleagues in expressing our deep condolences to the victims of Hurricane Harvey. All Americans stand with the people of Texas who have been devastated by this terrible storm as we work to recover and rebuild their communities. And our thoughts and prayers are also with the people of Florida as they prepare for Hurricane Irma. I urge everyone in the path of this horrible storm to pay attention to instructions from local officials to stay safe. In the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey, I'm pleased to see that the legislation before us today includes $15 billion in emergency funding to help the people of Texas put their lives back together. Congress should and must provide this needed relief. And in due time, if the devastation from Irma is anywhere near as bad as predicted, obviously, I and others will support sending federal funding to assist the people of Florida with recovery. That is clearly a requirement and a function of government. I also support increasing the debt ceiling as necessary way to prevent default on our government debt. However, I cannot in good conscience support those very important pieces of this legislation if it also means supporting a continuing resolution. I have come to this floor many times to talk about the harmful effects of continuing resolutions on our military. Year after year, we have lurched from one short-term fix to another without doing the hard work of governing and budgeting. And year after year, I have reminded my colleagues that continuing resolutions are not only no way to fund the government, they inflict great harm upon those Americans we are constitutionally obliged to provide for, and that's our men and women in uniform. Our defense leaders have also sounded the alarm. For the last several years, our senior military and civilian leaders have come to the Senate Armed Services Committee and asked for the same thing, that Congress provide stable, predictable funding and that we provide it on time. Is that a lot to ask? Stable, predictable funding, and provided on time? In testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee this year, Secretary Mattis pointed out that, and I quote, during 9 of the last 10 years, Congress has enacted 30 separate continuing resolutions to fund the Department of Defense, thus inhibiting our readiness and adaptation to new challenges. He asked Congress to pass a fiscal year 2018 budget in a timely manner to avoid yet another continuing resolution. Let me explain. A continuing resolution just continues at previous year's levels, and I will talk about some of the impact that continuing resolutions have had. The chairman of our Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dunford, also stated, and I quote, without sustained, sufficient, and predictable funding, I assess, this is from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he says, I assess that within 5 years, we will lose our ability to project power, the basis of how we defend the homeland, advance U.S. interests, and meet our alliance commitments. Now, my dear friends and colleagues, that doesn't come from John McCAIN. That comes from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who says that without predictable funding, within 5 years, we will lose our ability to project power, the basis of how we defend the homeland, etc. I couldn't have to remind anyone that threats are on the rise around the world. Global terrorist networks, increasing great power competition with Russia and China, malign Iranian influence spreading across the Middle East, a North Korean dictator racing to acquire missiles that can hit the United States with nuclear weapons. The threats to our national security have not been more complex or daunting than at any time in the past 7 decades. And let us not forget that we are a nation at war. There are brave young men and women serving in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places. But we must always ask ourselves, are we really doing all that we can to support them? There is no point to discussing our strategy for Afghanistan or North Korea or ISIS or any of the other myriad of threats we're currently facing if we're simply going to fund the military through a continuing resolution. My friends, the state of our military is dire. The overwhelming majority of our forces are not fit for combat in the near term. Three out of our 59 Army brigades are combat ready. 4 of 64 Air Force squadrons are ready to, quote, fight tonight. That means fully combat ready. Less than half of the Marine and Navy planes are ready for combat. The Air Force has a shortfall of 1,500, 1,000 of which are fighter pilots. The Navy has a maintenance backlog of 5.4 million man-days scheduled for 2017. The hard truth is our military is declining. And this President of the United States campaigned with a full commitment of rebuilding our military. We do a continuing resolution. We are not only rebuilding our military, we are harming our military. The hard truth is the military is declining. For the evidence of this, we need to look no further than all of the headlines about ship collisions and aviation accidents during peacetime training operations, incidents that have tragically taken the lives of dozens of our brave men and women in uniform. The incident involving USS McCAIN, which killed 10 young sailors, is only the latest example. So how did we get here? How did we get into this position? Uncertain budgets that are consistently late, continuing to increase operational tempo for our military despite not having sufficient money to pay for it, making cuts elsewhere to stay afloat, like training and maintenance, and we are about to do the same thing. Apparently watching as young men and women die for entirely avoidable reasons seems not to be enough for us to change. To be sure, while the budget alone will not fix all of our underlying causes of the recent incidents, the military cannot improve without timely and growing budgets. And yet, that is exactly what a CR, a continuing resolution, will not provide. A continuing resolution will lock the Department of Defense into last year's funding levels. It will prevent them from reprogramming funding to meet emerging needs, and it will prohibit the start of new programs to modernize for future threats. And perhaps worst of all, a continuing resolution will mandate a level of spending $52 billion less than the President's budget request. The military cannot fix its readiness problems without more funding. The military cannot grow its forces to meet the expanding requirements of the global threat environment under a continuing resolution. A continuing resolution will not allow our military to modernize its forces to ensure we maintain our strategic advantage over our competitors. So while the President and this Congress understand that the military does have a need for additional funding to rebuild the military, we are asking them to keep treading water for 3 months. Tread water for 3 months, for no reason whatsoever. A continuing resolution is a crutch that we rely on when we can't pass actually appropriations bills. It's a temporary solution to avoid the worst possible outcome, a federal shutdown, to allow us more time to reach a solution for funding the government. The majority of us can agree that continuing resolutions is not the proper way of funding government. Congress can't perform oversight by passing continuing resolutions. The federal government can't execute effectively or efficiently when locked into last year's funding bills. Having to pass a continuing resolution, by all accounts, is a failure by the Congress of the United States to fund the federal government. I understand the need to use these from time to time, as bipartisan spending agreements not always easy to come by. What I don't understand is why we are voting on a continuing resolution 3 weeks before the actual start of the next year, without having spent any time in the Senate actually trying to pass an appropriations bill or negotiating a bipartisan budget agreement. How is it that we are voting on a continuing resolution, a mechanism of last resort, before we've even made a single attempt at funding the government? There's been no discussion of a bipartisan budget deal. There hasn't even been a fiscal year 2018 budget resolution. We have not called up a single 2008 appropriations bill, not a single one. for 2018. Quite simply, we've not been doing our jobs. If we're going to call ourselves the world's greatest deliberative body, we've got to do one heck of a lot better. We have 3 weeks before we need to pass fiscal year 2018 funding. Why have we given up before even trying? We could be spending this month debating the bipartisan budget deal we all know we will need to pass now in December. Attaching emergency funding for hurricane relief to a must-pass continuing resolution and debit limit increase is irresponsible and a dereliction of our most routine duties. It is a result of yet another self-inflicted, I repeat, self-inflicted crisis. Instead of returning to the regular order by moving individual spending bills to fund our government and our national security priorities with ample time for debate and amendment, we are shirking our responsibilities and kicking the can down the road. All of us are responsible for the detriment of the men and women serving in our military during a time of incredible global uncertainty. So I would like to vote to provide assistance to the people of Texas. I cannot vote for another continuing resolution that will harm our men and women in uniform.